The point of a horror movie is to bring up an intense feeling of shock, disgust, and most importantly, fear. But the horror genre is not a checklist. It's an ever changing tool to create fear in the audience that evolves throughout the years. In this case, I'll talk about the use of mental illness through a horror lens in order to compare them through historical context, using both 1960's Psycho and 2017's Split. Now, before I start, please be aware that I'm going to be spoiling content for these two movies and for the rest that are going to be listed up front. And finally, this video is not a review to determine which one is better, but it's simply to express how horror can be portrayed on film. Psycho was directed by Alfred Hitchcock and debuted on September 8th of 1960. The film starts off what's considered the second golden age of Hollywood, which takes place during the 60s and 70s. During this time, the old restrictions of the 1930s were re-updated. This meant that any sexual, obscenity, and violent content was more accessible by directors to direct movies that aren't supposed to be family friendly. In this case, it's most commonly known as the R rating that we have today. While the film itself does have an R rating, it doesn't show anything as controversial compared to future films during this age, like Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. This film was the last studio contract Hitchcock had with Universal Studios, and while the director did have a bunch of hype for his final project, it wasn't viewed as such since he and the studio execs weren't seeing each other eye to eye. He essentially still wanted to finish his last film with a bang. Unfortunately, some early reviews had mixed opinions on the matter, some calling them great while others got bored of it. The director honestly felt like his final movie was an overall joke, amusing to be specific. It doesn't change the final product being set with such a horror aesthetic. It also added its own element of realism. Of course, the mental illness that's being portrayed in this specific film isn't as realistic by today's standards. It's more about the questions that the concept provides. One about accountability and who's really responsible for your actions. It's a topic that I'll get to in a second. Flash forward 57 years and you get a film like Split on January 20th of 2017, which was directed by M. Night Shyamalan. This film was made during a different point in time. Any type of controversial media was pretty common and still had the R rating, with movies like Deadpool, Hush, and Logan. This was also during an era of interconnected franchises, the most popular being Marvel Studios and the Avengers. Split follows in its footsteps by making it a sequel to one of his previous works, Unbreakable. And then there's the final film in the franchise that connects both Unbreakable and Split, that being Glass. Luckily, the movie wasn't promoted as a franchise, so there isn't much need to require the other two films for this analysis. This was Shyamalan's sixth project out of the 7 films he has under his belt. Unfortunately, this also came after his previous works that weren't acclaimed as well as his early projects, such as Unbreakable and The Happening. It started with The Last Airbender, After Earth, and The Visit. The eventual success in Split helped the director get back on track. This film also brings up the topic of mental illness. It actually becomes the main focus throughout the film, since the multiple personalities are established towards the first act. So instead of dwelling on the concept between instigator and victim, it's a movie about survival between hunter and prey. Picture this. Our main female character that we start off at the beginning of the film gets put in a situation which involves her being stranded with our male opposing character. At first glance, there is something off about this character, as if he has a chip on his shoulder. It's then revealed that this character suffers from multiple personality disorder. This female then proceeds onto a survival trial to get away from the male character or to catch him red-handed. This male character doesn't die, but there's this form of internal acceptance with his mental illness, ending with a lingering feeling of inevitability. This guy will haunt you forever. Fade to black, end credits. Of course, this description was vague enough to describe either film, but it doesn't change the fact that they're very similar since both projects started off with little hope either it being the last project with a company that you don't like anymore, or after your unsuccessful streak about to go one film up. On the contrary, these films were huge turning points for their careers and have received the recognition that they deserve. Both these films have subverted a bunch of expectations for their own times. Psycho killed off the quote-unquote main character in the halfway mark of the film and shifted its point of view between both the killer and the worried relatives of the victim. This also creates a dramatic irony between the audience and the characters, because we are the ones who have information that the characters don't. The same aspect was applied to Split by subverting expectations towards the ending. Kevin showed mercy by not killing Casey, even though he had the perfect opportunity to. Because Casey was able to survive the interaction with him, it was all over when she was able to show him her scars, stating that she has also suffered and therefore should be alive in the world.
Your heart is pure. Rejoice!
This creates a great uncertainty towards the end. We feel more terrified of what Kevin is going to do to the rest of the world instead of what she's going to do to Casey. It's the uncertainty that these characters express due to their mental illness that creates the horror elements in both films. Kevin never got caught while Norman is still in jail, but this never meant that the rest of the characters were safe. Kevin was able to reach his goal of belief when all of his personalities express and communicate to each other the fact that they survived a shotgun point blank to the chest. They continued to discuss their next step. Even though Norman was in jail, the consequences were internal. The monologue is from the mother's personality and takes place entirely in its head. It has completely taken over Norman's mind, and because he's caught, the blame can be shifted to Norman himself, not his mental illness. It ends the film with the uneasy feeling that there's not any justice for Norman. The same way the knowledge of Marion's whereabouts won't bring her back. It's irreversible. Then there's the concept of multiple personality disorder. It's more commonly and clinically known as dissociative identity disorder, or DID. It's a very controversial subject because it's very difficult in diagnosing such disorders into something factual that they can explain and solve. It goes as far as some clinicians thinking that this disorder doesn't even exist. And even if it's real, then there's the fear that any criminal can get off the hook easily by blaming it on an entirely different personality, and therefore you lose accountability for their actions. It's a concept that has always been difficult to be categorized as an official diagnosis, but it doesn't mean that it can't be disproved. It just means that if a clinic does believe in the validity, then the patient might go through a much longer treatment. According to the U.S. National Library of Medicine, the cause of DID is attributed to the effects of exposure to situations of extreme ambivalence and abuse in early childhood. Due to this exposure, the child will cope with such traumas by being in denial and shift the impact onto someone else. It might start out as an imaginary friend in order to not face what has happened. Quite literally, disassociating their experiences to someone else. Then there's also the type of parenting that can factor into DID. The child to be raised under authoritarian and very rigid parenting can also develop a disorganized or disoriented pattern of attachment growing up. DID serves as a coping mechanism in order to avoid traumas that the patient has gone through. Norman talks very highly about his mother and will deny and justify the clear signs of abuse to the fact that his mother simply knows better. Whenever Norman uses his mother's personality, her first thought upon noticing Marion is that she thinks of her as a whore. The fourth entry in the Psycho franchise depicts the origins of Norman and his relationship with his mother. The mother, Norma Bates, is a very contradicting person. She thinks very highly of herself and believes that all women, besides herself, only look for sexual interactions, and will have advantage of you when the moment presents itself, only for her to start going out with someone else, Norman's new stepdad. The fact that they're both wearing robes in Norma's happy mood obviously states of what just happened the night before. She's doing the very thing she swore was considered unforgivable and sinful. It's in retaliation that Norman poisoned both his mother and his stepdad out of anger due to her hypocrisy. But because she didn't want to accept that she's dead, he kidnapped her body and used her clothes to give her the belief that she was still alive and giving him orders around the house. Kevin, on the other hand, is a little bit trickier since Split is the only source of Kevin's origins and his background is not the main focus of the film. We know that his father passed away in the crash of the Eastrail 177 in 2000. The same train was crashed by Elijah Price, or most commonly known as Mr. Glass, from Unbreakable and Glass. And the small flashback that Kevin gets after hearing his name for the first time indicates that his mother was very abusive and controlling. In order to not get in trouble, his first personality developed into Dennis. Dennis is a clean freak, readjusting small things around the room, color-coding cleaning supplies, and always brings a handkerchief so he won't get germs. It's unsure on how the rest of the personalities came to be, since Kevin has up to 24 personalities and the film focuses on only 5 overall. It's surprisingly accurate for a person to have this many personalities. They can range from 2 to even 100. These alternate personalities, or alters, develop a sort of stability over long periods of time, and each one works for a certain role throughout the day, while others can harbor aggressive tendencies. This could be due to the environment they're in or to the people they have to encounter, something like a defense mechanism to complete tasks that other alters might not be able to do so. The point of a horror movie is to bring up the most important feeling in this genre, that is fear, and fear can be portrayed in a bunch of different ways for the audience to interpret. When mental illness is thrown in the mix, then you get the feeling of uncertainty. Kevin was receiving care for years from her doctor, but was still unable to help him. Norman treated Marion with respect and kindness, but it won't bring her back. The fact that we don't know what's going through their head is what terrifies us, then and now.
They'll see, and they'll know, and they'll say, why, she wouldn't even harm a fly.